Welcome to VO Life and Gravy for the Brain Oceania, the interview. And we've been covering some great topics and really delving into a few of the genres of voiceover in this interview series and meeting the people, the kind of legends of the industry, my voiceover heroes who I've always wanted to meet and talk to. And so I'm very excited this time, because today we're covering audiobooks, and I'm a big fan of audiobooks. Like, I really try and get through as many as I can. There is an audiobook narrator who, Derek Perkins, I'm just going to say his name, been a fan of for a long time, especially for his non-fiction work, but recently found out that he does fiction as well. So I'm going to quickly play a couple of clips from him so you can familiarize yourself with his voice.
The discovery of the non-existence of places is an intriguing byway in the history of exploration. The most recent example came in 2012, when an Australian survey vessel visited Sandy Island, 700 miles east of Queensland, and found that it was not there. This despite the fact that a stretched-out oval, 15 miles long and about 3 miles wide, had been on the map for almost as long as people had been charting these seas. She had been pacing the room to keep warm for some time before two maids finally sauntered in with a basket of peat. "Restart the fire, please," Alison said. "Feels warm as a fresh dung heap to me," one of them said. "Must be that weak Douglas blood." "Why isn't that new husband of yours here keeping you warm?" the other said. "Does he not like you any better than our last laird?" Though Alison should be immune to their insolence by now, she was tired and cold, and the remark stung. Why had Wedderburn left their wedding bed and stayed away 2 more nights? She wondered what price she would pay for offending him.
So on the line from his home in France is Derek Perkins. Good morning.
Morning, Toby. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So I want to start by actually saying a proverb I came up with just before, in the time before the interview, which is, and this is so true for me, that a good book read poorly is worse than a bad book read well.
That speaks to me.
And wouldn't you agree that, like, sometimes it can really ruin the experience if an audiobook isn't read correctly?
Oh, totally. I mean, the thing I've found since I've been in the business is that it's incredibly personal to everybody who's listening. And while that's, I think you can't deny that if a person doesn't find your voice good or appealing, that's going to turn them off. But I think there's a huge difference between that and whether a book's read well or not, technically. So it's an interesting kind of duality, I think, in the business, where you can read a book very well, but someone just doesn't like your voice. Yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. Couldn't agree more.
So you,
the way you tell them.
I did a little search in my Audible app just before, and for your name, and it had 313 results, and then when I rechecked, it had gone up to 314. So I thought, good Lord! In the space of time it took me to do 2 searches, he's read another book. So tell us what your path has been to coming into this industry and then having narrated all of these books.
Well, briefly, I didn't get to the industry until very late, or relatively late in my career. I was in my 50s when I first got into it, and I had no background of performance, at least from a professional point of view. The one thread that's been consistent all along is that I had a love of performance in school. I entered voice speaking contests. I was in the drama club and so on, but nothing remotely professional. And I did start doing some volunteer work for reading books for the blind and dyslexic and people like that. And so that kind of gave me some initial sense of, well, this. I think I like reading. So I knew from doing the recordings, I knew I did. I think I might be okay at it. And then I happened to be on the set. It's too long a story to go into now, but I happened to be on the set of a movie called Shutter Island, which was a Martin Scorsese movie, as a background, I would say. Unfortunately, all the bits with me fell on the clippings. Clippings fell on the floor. But on the set one day, a couple of guys were talking, and they were talking about some voiceover work that they did. So I asked them about it, got in touch with the voiceover studio. Months later, they came back. I started doing some work for them. And as a result of that, I began tooling around on the internet and looking at audio business in general. And I suddenly came across audiobooks. And at that time, ACX was really pretty much getting off the ground. And I started working through ACX, and the rest, as they say.
Fantastic. And have you found it a struggle in terms of, going from dabbling, having another career and doing something on the side, to that? I hear from a lot of voices who are at that stage where they've done a few sort of voiceover jobs, but in order to do it properly, they need to make the leap, take that leap of faith. Was there a moment where you knew, this is what I want to do and I think I can do it? Or did you transition gently?
That's a really good question, because the answer is yes. The short answer is yes. And what happened with me, I think what happened with me was I started doing the ACX books, and I was beginning fairly quickly to get one or two companies, authors coming to me. So I thought, well, it's one thing, someone agreeing to you recording their books, because it's all royalty basis at that point, of course. But that to me seemed like a validation that what I was doing was of interest and appeal. So that was one piece. But you're absolutely right. At the time, of course, I had a full-time job. And there was a point in time where I was beginning to do enough of this work that it made me start thinking, do I really think I can make the leap? And I will say that I was incredibly fortunate to get into the industry at exactly the right point. I joke with people and say, I wish it was my pinpoint marketing and research for my career progression. But I just fell into it at the time when audiobooks started to shoot through the roof. And what happened was, as a result of that sudden takeoff, a number of publishers started looking around for voice talent. And they began looking through, sites like ACX that had loads of samples and stuff like that. And so I had a couple approach me. And that's when I started doing books for fee instead of on a royalty basis. And that's at the point at which after a few months of that, and it was coming in fairly regularly, I realized, did the maths and realized, I think this can work. But just to finish on that point, to your question, you still have to go through that bit of, do I leave my safe haven and take the leap or not? And I think at the end of the day, there's part gut intuition, there's part reading the signs that you're getting from people you're doing work with. And then at some part, you just have to let go. And I did, and I landed instead of crashed.
Fantastic. What sort of time frame was that? What year was that? Out of interest.
It was about 2012 when I first did the ACX titles. And then between that and the time when I turned fully professional was 3 years, 2015. And in the meantime, of course, it was all ramping up. It was about a 3-year kind of build up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Did geography play any part in it? Because, there's been this revolution in voiceover now, with home studios becoming so affordable and accessible that you don't need to be near a recording studio, for example. And I know you've moved around a little bit. Is it something that sort of does geography play any part in your career?
Yes and no. In terms of being limited because you're not in one of the main areas. In the US, as you know, you basically got the big hubs on the West Coast, the East Coast, a little bit in the middle. So in terms of needing to physically be located there, again, I hit it just right, because the demand was such. Studios were prepared to accept people. In fact, they liked people recording from their home studios because it lowered their own costs. So it's absolutely never been an issue for me. And as you mentioned, we moved from the UK to the US. That's where I started doing the work. And then recently we've moved to France, and it's been completely seamless thanks to the wonders of the internet and so on. The one thing I would add to that, though, in terms of geography, is that, again, I feel like I've been fortunate that coming from the UK, as I have originally, in America, and one of the Canadian companies I work with, it kind of puts you in a little bit of a niche position, because there's a whole ton of American actors and talents, but there's not so many Brits. So when studios have titles that call for, you know, that accent, or maybe a little bit of knowledge about that particular area, they tend to, you know, I found they tend to come to me. So it gives you a little bit of a leg up in a very competitive marketplace.
Absolutely, and especially since your normal speaking voice is actually quite an interesting mix of accents. What would you, it's actually not what I was expecting, because I've listened to you on the non-fiction, and it's very kind of RP, but you've got kind of an interesting mix of accents. Where are you originally from in England?
Well, firstly, I think you're being very kind. I would say it's probably a mess of accents, but no, I was born and brought up in southeast London, Croydon area. Lived there for 18 years. Went to college in Wales, West Wales, so you couldn't get much of a difference, and much more of a difference in accents and everything
There's still
else.
some Wales in there. I knew it was there. I knew Welsh was in there somewhere.
And then, you know, what was I don't know, I was in my 30s when we moved to the States, and we lived for 21, 22 years in the States. So a long time. Now we're back in France, so we'll see how the accent evolves from here.
Yeah. And you're a polyglot, is that right? You speak many languages?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I'm, you know, greatly fluent, but yeah, I took French, Russian, and Welsh in college, and of course my French is improving significantly since we've been here. I can still order a beer in a bar in Russian and talk a little bit, talk about rugby in Welsh, and that's about it.
Yeah, just the essentials.
Yeah,
because I wondered if you were thinking about. I mean, you know, it would be so hard to be an audiobook narrator in different accents. You'd have to be so good at not just the language but the accent, wouldn't you? If you wanted to do it in other languages completely, I imagine.
Yeah, no, that's a good point too. I do think it helps me. Obviously, in the languages that I've studied, it really does help you to talk in English with those accents. Yeah, absolutely. It just kind of gives you that inner ear for it, I find.
And also, if words in those languages come up, you know how to pronounce them correctly, which is a big bugbear of mine, especially with French words. If they come up in, sorry, American narrators, but some American pronunciations of French words are not great.
No, you're right. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. And going on from that, the first question in the kind of craft section, I want to talk about, you know, what your approach to audiobook narration is, and the basic question of how do you prep? You know, you're selected for a book, or you might have auditioned for it, and then you receive your copy, and I imagine you don't just hit record and start reading. There's an element of prep there. What do you do?
Well, it basically breaks into two sections. It depends on whether it's a non-fiction book or a fiction book. With fiction books, in general terms, there's very little issues with pronunciations of words themselves, because they're not technical. They don't generally carry lots of foreign words and so on. But with the fiction books, the most important thing, and I've learned this over the years, is you really just have to understand, obviously, the story. You need to understand the characters. Particularly with mystery and fantasy, you need to make absolutely sure that the characters stay the same, because authors have a great habit of switching, you know, page 10 pages from the back of the book, the character that was Canadian suddenly turns into a closet Frenchman or something. And so you need to know where the characters evolve to and from. And you also, it's just critically important. You've got to have that sense of what's the author's, I mean, a point of view is a cliche term, but what's the author trying to do here? What's the tone of their writing, and what's the atmosphere that they're setting in this book? So I try to reflect that as much as possible from the prep I do in the reading. Personally, what I then do is I'll often go through, as I'm preparing the script, I'll often go through and I'll write out character names, and I'll put some notes in based on the descriptions of them in the script. And I may add a couple of notes of my own in terms of what I think I'll do for the voice. And that's it. I don't do much more than that. To a certain extent, and certainly with lesser characters, I sometimes play around a bit because I deliberately don't want to have too firm of an idea of how I'm going to voice them. So I'll almost literally wait till the last moment to see what comes out. And sometimes, most times it works, but if I'm not happy, I'll stop it and do something else. So that's the fiction. Nonfiction is very different. Nonfiction, there's clearly, an issue with needing to understand, again, the content, the kind of tone the author is using. But with nonfiction books, generally, it's far more important to get pronunciations right, and particularly in the ones that relate, that relate to history or a particular topic that has its own, terminology and nomenclature and so on. So, for example, I think it was last year or the year before that I read a huge history of Iran. And you can imagine for a non-native, that's a challenge for pronunciations. And I ended up with I think there were about 820 plus words that I needed to get pronunciations right for. And it turned out to be a wonderful experience because the author is now in Oxford University. He's an Iranian scholar, and he readily agreed to help me. So I sent him this list, and we sat on the telephone, and he literally pronounced these words one by one by one. So then my job then is I'll record him, then I'll transliterate each one of those words, put it in a spreadsheet, and then as I'm going through the script, reading, I stop and check the pronunciations and go on from there. Yeah, so it's a pretty intensive process, but if you're going to do it right,
Absolutely, and I think there's a real pleasure in you're able to grow yourself, like you say, like by learning the proper way to pronounce things. And I've always had this real penchant for wanting to pronounce things like the way a native would, and especially if it's in a completely different vowel set, or if it's in a different part of the mouth, like in Arabic, for example. There's all these h and stuff that we don't, in the Western world, we don't even really hear. So it's really nice to practice using these other parts of our mouth to get a really genuine pronunciation.
Yeah, it is. And one other quick point on that, I couldn't agree with you more. For me, again, maybe it's coming from a language background. For me, the language is not something in isolation. It's a representation of that culture, and it's a representation of the people, from that country. So I consider it just to be a sign of respect for the author, but also respect for the people hearing it. And I have been criticized for one or two books I've done that I won't mention for the accents or the pronunciations, and so you learn from those. But to me, it's giving the author and the language and the country their dues.
Absolutely. Is it important for fiction, especially if it's serialized fiction, which I know you've done a few sort of series, to understand the world that it's occurring in as well? Is that important?
Yeah. Do you mean the world of the fiction?
World of the book, exactly. Yeah. So like when so that you understand kind of the context for the characters, not just the characters themselves.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the best ones, the really well written ones, particularly in fantasy, they just transport you into that world, and you find that. You just feel, I go into my booth and I leave my home, and I'm suddenly transported into this other dimension. And absolutely, it is important. And it's interesting too, because these worlds that they depict, oftentimes you see the strands coming back to our current world that we live in, and you see a little bit like people read into Lord of the Rings. They read sort of subtle messages and so on, and you see it in some of these books. And I like that when it's well done. It's very very powerful.
It is, absolutely. Yeah. So your nonfiction work, this is how I was introduced to your work, was through listening to *Sapiens, Homo Deus, and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century* by Yuval Noah Harari, who is just fantastic books, and they've been,
Yes.
they've sold very well around the world. Um,
Yes.
do, how do you select a kind of do you have a default tone for nonfiction, or is it kind of like a character you're playing for that particular nonfiction?
Well, I'm glad you asked. um, the answer is that I, by and large, I try to align onto what I think is the most appropriate for the content. Most of the time, I don't make a particular effort to do that necessarily. It depends on the book. So, for example, for *Sapiens*, I obviously knew the script, but I didn't have a particular thought of, oh, I need to adopt this tone. I gave it a straight read in that sense. But for example, nonfiction, particularly autobiographies that I've read, I did one by the old Sex Pistol, Johnny Rotten, John Lydon, and I did Anthony Lloyd Webber's first part of his autobiography. And there, I made a definite effort just to try to get some sense into the reading of who those people were. So with John Lydon, I made my accent a little more London than, like you said, RP. With Anthony Lloyd Webber, I did that a little bit, but I also tried to. Lots of characters in those books, of course, that relating stories all the time, and the people they're talking about. I'd get. This is the wonder of YouTube, of course. So you jump on YouTube, you get the clips, and then I just try to put enough in there to give a flavor of those people. For the most part, for the rest of it, as I say, no, it's a straight read. And you are just a quick additional point. It's interesting you talk about my accent reading, because I'm always struck by it too. I don't do anything to force that. It just is the way it comes out. And I figure if that's the natural way I read, I'm not going to change it.
It's so funny, and I have the same thing when I'm reading a formal read. I'll go straight into RP without even like thinking I'm doing an accent, and it's more like you have to adopt. Voicing is a full body experience. It's not just talking like as we all know. Do you remember the film The Matrix, where they go into the Matrix and they're in that white space, and he says, "Oh, like I look different than I do in the real world," and it's like his residual self-image. It's called, and I feel like there's a voice version of that when you stop trying and you stop contriving everything and you just go, this is me. It's not a performance. I'm getting out of the way of the text. I'm just relaying the text. And I guess that's the ultimate goal with nonfiction, isn't it? To kind of get out of the way.
Absolutely. And that's a very good point. And I think by sort of being natural to yourself, you can make yourself invisible, which is how you should be.
Absolutely. So moving on to the fiction world, and I'm interested in this because I've always been like a real nonfiction lover. I'm like, if you're listening to something, you might as well learn something. But fiction, there's just this it's so enjoyable to listen to. And I just finished listening to the Audible's adaptation of Neil Gaiman's Sandman, which was a very famous graphic novel from back. But it's like an all-star cast kind of a thing, and it's all incredibly like comic book over the top character stuff, rather than one person switching in different characters. But like, do you enjoy fiction more than you do nonfiction, or do they both have their own kind of places in your heart?
Ooh, that's
making you choose a child.
Yes, that's a tough one. To all my clients listening, ignore my answer. Well, I will actually. I'll give you my standard answer, but it's a heartfelt answer. When I get asked, "What's your favorite book or type of book to read?" and my answer always is one that's well written. So I will say that I enjoy well written fiction every bit as much as I do nonfiction. I think I probably have a little bit more, to be honest, a natural penchant for nonfiction in my performance. But I hugely enjoy fiction, and I've had some success with the Gongs and so on. I've had some success with with fiction. Sorry.
Hmm.
I just one quick example. There's a series by an author called Mary Stewart. It's a Merlin. It's based on the historical character Merlin, and it's a trilogy. And my lord, that trilogy was such a joy. It's so gorgeously written. And of course, Merlin. The history of Merlin is not just Britain, but it's also Wales, where I'm half Welsh and spent significant time there. So it was wonderful, but the writing was extraordinary, and it was an absolute joy. And now it goes back to your earlier point, transporting yourself into that world. It was effortless.
Absolutely. Right. It's the same for commercial voiceover. You come across scripts which are just so well written, it's just effortless. Like it just, when you get a good reader and a good script together, it's a beautiful thing. So again, to go into the fiction world a little bit, characters. How do you go about constructing them? You give them accents. Do you give them affectations? Like how do you and if there are many characters, are you aware that you have to differentiate them?
Yeah. I think I started off like a lot of people probably do, thinking that you need great big huge gaps between character voices. They've got to be massively different. And I remember listening to a book that Simon Vance narrated. One of the what was it? I knew I'd blank on this. It was a trilogy written by the Swedish writer. It'll come back to me. But I was absolutely struck by the subtlety of the differentiation he made between the voices. So I think to me, it depends on the character as to how forceful I'm going to be with the voice. So I take an awful lot of cues from the script to help me decide how I'm going to do the voice. And then, of course, there's some purely physical things. I remember doing one book, a fantasy book, that had a character of a dragon in it. So I started off by giving it the rough, gruff, really kind of rough voice. And then I realized this character goes throughout the whole book. And so it was a long road to hoe. So you have to get that bit right as well. But afterwards, it's just, I think I've become a little more subtle in the differentiations of character voices. And I use probably as much pacing and intonation now to help with that, especially with female voices, of course, which are very difficult, I find, and difficult for men generally, I think. So that's the way I've tried to evolve.
Yeah, you don't want to get all sort of Monty Python on the. He's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy.
I don't want to sound like Terry Jones. No.
Oh dear. Do you do other sort of voicing in terms of commercial voicing? Like, do you have another career as a? Because I know that you've in your book, which we'll talk about a bit later, there's a whole chapter called "Audiobooks is not voiceover."
Yes.
So do you have a foot in both camps? Have you sort of learned both crafts?
I would say I've dabbled in voiceover, and I honestly don't think I'm that good at it, and so I don't really pursue it. So I've effectively, particularly since the move to France, I've effectively just taken an attitude. I'm not going to do anything proactive on it. So, but I have, yes, I've voiced for companies that have been reasonable. I mean, Johnson & Johnson and one of the big banks on the northeast coast of the US. But I have to say, it's a very, as you well know, far better than me. It's a very different type of work. And I think I just think I'm more suited and better at audiobook work. And again, as you said, scripts vary with voiceover too.
Yeah, they can substantially.
Being diplomatic, yes.
Because it is really like the audiobook is like the marathon versus the sprint. I think you put it of voiceover, where you're just dealing with certain words and inflections, and it's all incredibly nuanced. Just
to pick up on that very quickly. Again, that's one of the biggest things in the book. I talk about, you can break it down into marathon, sprint, or you can break it down into. To me, voiceover is all about words and phrases, maybe not even whole sentences, or not complete sentences. And it's very much that full. It is like a sprint. It's like a full bore effort. You got to get every single word right. The intonation has to be just right, and so on. Whereas in the audiobook world, and I'm actually, ironically, I ran marathons for a number of years, so I have that. I think runners, they say, you have fast twitch muscle, fast twitch or slow twitch, and I would never be a sprinter because if I was an animal, I'd be a sloth, you know. So I think the audiobook world is just such a natural fit for me from a number of perspectives like that. But it's nice and paced. It has its own challenges, of course, in that, because with that pacing comes sustained effort, as you mentioned earlier, over a period of time. But
especially if you're playing a dragon, it sounds like.
Especially if you're playing a dragon. Yeah. It burns the studio.
So let's talk about the tech behind your setup. What gear do you use to record? What's your sort of your acoustic space and your microphone and interface and that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, as with most people starting out in the business, you know, I was in the closet, as it were, and literally cupboard in the basement. And every time my poor wife, every time she went into the kitchen and walked around, I used to have to bang on the ceiling, tell her to stop. There was no washing. You couldn't put the heating on. And then once I started getting into it professionally, I bought my first studio, which lasted me till we moved here, actually. So, which was a Whisper Room as a brand in the US, fairly well known. And it's just, you know, it's just a completely encased booth, which you set up inside in the basement, in my case. So that was fine. Since coming here, I've invested in a Studio Bricks booth, and it's the pro version, so it's triple walled, and it's the answer to a voiceover or narrator's dream, because the room I'm in, I literally don't hear anything, and so, which is what you want from the outside. So so that's my studio, which is fantastic. The sound is great.
While we're on that point, before we get onto mics and technology, it's such an important thing to sort of create this space where you can just focus on what you're doing, and you're not having to think about what did I hear just then, or, you know, it breaks your flow, isn't it? Because I live near a big road, and this isn't the perfect studio for me. I'm building one next year, which I'm titling it as, you know, it's going to be the best studio and best voiceover studio in the world. So here's hoping. But currently I've got logging trucks that go past, and I have to kind of make excuses when I'm doing live sessions. But do you have anything in your booth that makes it kind of like a nice space? Like do you have like scents in there, or light levels, or do you do anything like that, or is it just?
No, the one thing I do, actually, I do have a number of little mementos from various parts of my life, very tiny little ones that are underneath the monitor. And there's a carving that my son did. One of my favorite bird of all time is the blue heron. So he carved me a blue heron once. So I've got that on the desk. But otherwise, no, I'm not worried about. Certainly don't want scents. You know, I'm not worried about anything else. I just like the fact that there's no distractions. The quality of the booth is absolutely fantastic, and you know, I can just focus on what I need to focus on.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so outline what you use to capture your voice.
Yeah, it's and I'll just very quickly say that before one of the best decisions I took setting my studio up was to go to a professional studio, a professional audio shop, and get them to advise me. So I use a Shure KSM 32 microphone, omnidirectional. It's a condenser microphone. It's the only one I've ever used. I'm a great proponent of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Exactly. And also don't spend money when you don't need to. So nobody has ever said your voice doesn't sound great with your microphone. So I've kept it and hope to keep it. Then I use the preamp is a Grace preamp. I use a PreSonus now. I was using an M-Box for the audio interface, but now it's a PreSonus. And my computer is a Mac Mini.
Right.
And
Perkins, don't you?
Then I run Pro Tools, yeah. And there's a little irony here that I switched to Mac because I thought it'd be far more stable, because the other one used to crash occasionally.
Right.
I get lots of crashes on this Mac. I don't know why.
Oh, no.
But otherwise, it's a great setup. And Pro Tools 12.0 I'm on at the moment.
I bet you have some horror stories of, spending like half a day in a booth and getting out and realizing that it crashed early on or corrupted.
Well, not quite that end of worldish, but if I get a good run on a recording, I could be recording for maybe 5 minutes before I need to stop, which doesn't sound like a lot. But if you're recording the history of Iran and you're going through multiple difficult pronunciations and your computer crashes and you've lost that last 5 minutes, it does not make your day. So hasn't been too bad, but at some point, I'll upgrade. But otherwise, for the time being, it's fine.
Absolutely. Going back to the mic thing, I think that's a very sensible choice in terms of like sticking with the same one that you've always had, because it's sort of how it records your voice, and as you say, if it isn't broke, sort of don't fix it. And I've had experiences where I inherited a really nice, a beautiful mic, a Neumann U67, which is like the valve version of the 87, which are like worth $10,000 US or something. And yes. I was using this to record and doing pretty well out of it. But then I thought, like, I wonder if anyone would actually notice if I just recorded on a different mic. And so I got myself the 416, the Sennheiser 416, just your standard, like, one of the most, ubiquitous voiceover mics there are. And switched to that. And for 6 months, just no one noticed. No one made any comments or anything. I got the same number of jobs, if not more. So I thought, well, there's no point in having capital tied up in this expensive microphone, and sold it. So it was a really interesting thing for me. But now I wouldn't go. I don't think I'd go off the 416, just because it's like it becomes your sound, and I think you'd find that. Did you find there was a difference between the whisper room and the studio bricks? There'd probably be some kind of difference.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think the whisper room was good, but it was single wall, different construction to the studio bricks completely. And I think, fundamentally there was always a little bit of boominess in there. They just didn't have that. Of course, as you never want the sound to be completely dead. You want a little bit of life to it, but it always had that feel to it. Whereas this one feels, when I'm listening to my voice and I'm playing it back, I think I'm hearing it's much. It's a richer sound. It's just a better sound. I'm not very good with describing sound, but it just seems to be a sound that's got lots of color in it, but it hasn't got any of that slight tinniness, slight boominess that I used to get in the other one.
And
so
do you
I'm really happy with it.
And compress your recordings at all, or do you?
No, I don't. Right. No, I don't touch them. It's another one of my mantras. If I'm not paid to do something, I won't do it. So, but seriously, my viewpoint is very simple. I love recording, and I get paid to record. I don't get paid to twiddle around. And more to the point, when studios ask you for raw audio, I take them at their word. So I literally give them whatever wave file, FLAC file, whatever format
which
they want.
Thank you for as well. Like it's well known in like audio geek circles that if you send them a recording that you've done noise reduction on and it sounds all tinny, they can't do anything with it. So it's like literally just.
Well, I was going to say, correct me if I'm wrong, right? But once you've tinkered with it yourself, you're dramatically limiting what can be done with it afterwards.
Exactly. Yeah. If you're not an expert in it, then it's like leave it alone.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I punch and roll and I make a clean recording. So I'm taking, if I hear mouth clicks or any extraneous noise, I'm taking that out as I go along. So the file is clean, but it's raw. Yeah.
So that's an interesting point. With editing, because a lot of I myself, when I'm doing long form work for e-learning or whatever, I'll read it and then I'll put a click in so I can see it and I'll go back and edit that later. Do you do it on the fly? So you're making a perfect audio file as you go?
Yes, and there's different schools of thought on that too. I mean, you've just mentioned one technique, and I know there are many audiobook narrators who use that technique. Personally, I just hate the thought of going back to something after you've finished. So I do it on the fly. And with Pro Tools, you know, punch and roll, it's so easy to do, and obviously with time you get quicker. It's almost no effort, so I do that, and
that's really
feel
interesting.
that it's,
That's the first time I've heard that, but that makes so much sense in terms of, and you're always at the cutting edge of what you're reading, so you're not sort of yeah, like I feel like you'd stay fresh for that stuff as well. And here's another thing: do you voice the characters separately after the fact, or you do it as you're going? You're switching constantly.
Oh yeah, absolutely. As you go, you go. Now I won't. I mean, in one of the fantasies, well, not one, many of the fantasy series, you probably get into 100, or the biggest number of characters I've ever had, I think it was about 260 in a series.
Wow.
Yeah. But of course, you can't remember all of those, so I just keep a little clip, do a little tiny little MP3 clip, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, whatever. Put them in a file, and then as I'm reading, if I've got to a character now who I need to refresh my memory about, then I'm going to stop the recording. I'm going to quickly flip to the file, listen to it, and then I'll carry on. But otherwise, no, it gets dropped in at the time.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Very interesting. Okay, well, let's go on to the kind of the business side of it, because we had quite a few questions in terms of like how to break into the market, because there are lots of people who, you know, love listening to audiobooks, they love reading, so, you know, they want to explore this as a career. What would your advice be in terms of the business of you know, of actually getting the work these days? Because it's probably, there's a lot more people wanting to do it these days, but then there's a lot more opportunity as well. So what would your advice
that's
be?
true. I was going to be flippant and say buy my book, but I wouldn't do that.
I'll talk about you, but don't worry.
I mean, in the US, in the context of the US market, I can only talk about that because that's the only experience I really have, US and one of the Canadian companies. I mean, if somebody said, give me one piece of advice, I would say what you need to do is two things. Number one, you need to get some experience. And if you need to get that by either volunteering or by recording through, you know, platforms like ACX, where the bar is relatively low and you can get some real good experience, do that. But then once you've done that and you know that you're okay at it and you know that you like doing it, then the best way is to go to the annual conference. There's an Audio Publishers Association in the US. It consists of all the major players, literally every one of the major players, and all of the you know, mid-sized ones below that. And they all go to this conference once a year, and it's usually in New York or occasionally somewhere else. And I couldn't believe it. The first time I went there, I looked at the list of people attending, and there's all these superstar narrators, and there's all these, you know, publishers, and not just, you know, they're not sending their mid-level people. You're getting the senior producers and directors of studios. So my advice to people is go there. You get opportunities in that conference. They set up little events which are so good. For example, they do a speed dating event where you have to, you know, you have to volunteer yourself and then be chosen. But so you get a chance to go. It is funny, about 2 minutes with each publisher, and you get a chance to, you know, strut. Well, you're not reading, but you're going to strut your stuff, and you're going to tell them who you are, what you've done, why you think you might be interesting to them. So you get opportunities like that. Well, the other big opportunity is where you do get to read to a real live publisher is a lunchtime session they do. And I am absolutely convinced that I've got one, if not two publishers out of those sessions. And above all, what it does is, you well know from voiceover work, companies that do this stuff, they have the slush pile of unsolicited demos that are a mile high, and they're forever trying to get through. And what I've always said to people is, if you get in front of a person, you don't need to spend more than 20 seconds with them. You're going to drop your card. You're going to then, when you follow up with your demo, you've then got a point of reference, and they got a
Mm.
point of reference to you.
Mm.
And that's my. If there's one thing I would encourage people to do, it's do that. The other point about it is, if publishers see you there, they know you're being serious, because it
Mm.
costs money.
Mm.
You know, most people have to travel there. You've got to pay for the fee. So if you're there, you're serious,
Mm.
and that's another qualifier.
Yeah.
So I couldn't recommend more highly.
Absolutely.
Long answer to your question, but
It's fantastic, and especially possibly with people with unusual accents as well, like from this part of the world, from Oceania and New Zealand. It's harder to get that, but I've definitely found with my kind of hodgepodge of a New Zealandy, Britishy kind of an accent, that especially the American market sits up and takes note a bit more than they would from an American voice, potentially, because they hear American voices all the time. So just by the very nature of the way you talk, you're kind of different, which is so I guess my advice is to not shy away if you have an accent that is not the mainstream, because people notice
not
you.
at all.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
That's very good to know. Are you ever required to go somewhere else to record? Do they ever want to record you in their studios?
No, I've had a request, but I turned it down politely. Would have meant me going to Chicago area and being in a hotel for a week or so. Paid, they offer to pay. But I just said, look, I got a fully fledged home studio here. Can we do it that way? And they said yes. So no, not now. That's the wonder of, again, as we said earlier, it's the wonder of the internet and so on. That home studios mean that you don't have to travel, and I'm glad for it, because it's a very inefficient way of recording, frankly.
It is for something so simple. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. If you're not right on the doorstep.
Yeah, absolutely, fantastic. So as you mentioned, you have a book which came out in 2015, which is called the Audiobook Narration Manual. And there was a really good, I had it lined up here. Let me just find, there was a really good part of it that really summed up what we've been talking about. It was, a good narrator is able to read ahead and quickly assimilate information in the text to ensure a seamless delivery of the spoken word. Before starting to narrate, she will ensure she understands the author's point of view. This in turn allows her to deliver the fullest meaning of the words spoken. This helps to avoid giving a rote delivery. Good narrators vary their speaking cadence and change their pace, tone, and volume to emphasize meaning and minimize distraction. And I felt like that really, in a very sort of cold way, summed up what I really liked about your voice was that, and you say in previous paragraphs about you're telling a story. Like everything is a story. Like the way it's just humans communicating ideas is a story. So what's your because often I'm training people who it sounds like it's being read. And even relatively good narrators will make it sound like it's not that interesting. What's your kind of secret to breathing life into scripts?
Oh God, that's a hard question. That's
30 words or less.
Yeah, exactly. How many hours have we got left? I mean, fundamentally, I think the secret is. This is going to sound a little bit foo-foo, but I think the secret is respecting the work that you're doing, respecting the effort the writer has had to put in to create that work, fiction, non-fiction. It's knowing that, it's understanding well enough what you're going to be reading. And when it's then the hardest thing for me is when you're doing it is being completely present for every minute that you're reading. And just a quick kind of example as to how I learned the importance of this. I took some coaching from Paul Rubin, who's one of the top guys in the audiobook industry in the US as a producer and a coach. And he was ruthless. So he'd have me read a section and I literally wouldn't get past more than about a sentence when he'd stop me. And then he'd challenge me and he said, "Did you really feel that?" And I honestly had to answer, no, I didn't. As to your point, I realized that I was reading it and I wasn't invested in it. It's very hard to explain without, as I say, sounding a bit esoteric, but I think that's it. I think it's the effort that has to be made, while on the one hand, you don't want you to be the you don't want you to be front and center. The content and the narrator, the author's work has to be front and center, but you've got to be in it. you've got to be completely committed to it. Otherwise, it's going to sound like a read. And that comes back to our earlier point about, marathons and sprints. And that's one of the challenges of audiobook work, because that's a long road to hoe. You've to consistently have that attention and focus and effort over a period of time is tough. And it's easy to just lose concentration. And the minute you lose concentration, you're out of it. Yeah. You're not in that world you talked about. Yeah, exactly. And then it sounds flat. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, that absolutely nails it, and I think it explains why you've had such success in your industry, and that you've risen to the top and have so many of these great titles, and people rave about your voice. So it's fantastic, and I imagine there's lots more really great advice such as that in your book. So it's on Amazon if anyone's interested in getting a copy. And I completely forgot to mention your amazing amount of glittering prizes in my intro, and you have had a lot of success in terms of winning Audies and being nominated at the Voice Sciences Awards, etc. So how did those come about? You've obviously into yourself and hope for the best?
No, actually, I don't. You can, but I never have. Maybe it's the Britishness in me. I always felt like I'm not worthy. Who am I to enter myself? So no, I never have. What tends to happen is when proofers are listening to your work, or the publishers use proofers, obviously, listen to your work. And I think what happens is a proofer, when they think this book's a bit special, the narration's really good, they flag it to the publisher, and then they review it. They have their own kind of committee that looks at all of these suggestions, and then they decide which ones they're going to put forward for awards. You don't know until the nominations are announced. So every one of those has been a very pleasant surprise. And I will sound a cautionary note, but that one of the early SOBAs, they call them, the Voice Arts Awards, I was nominated in one category, and there were 5 titles being considered, and I had 3 titles of those 5, and I still lost. So it was a great leveler.
Absolutely, there would be, wouldn't it? Just a few more quick questions before we get into our brief audience questions. Do you ever have a relationship with the authors? Do you like Yuval Noah Harari? Has he made touch because you're his mouthpiece effectively, or not?
Yeah. No, he never responds to my begging letters. Can I have some of the commission? I'd love to. Well, actually, yes, I do, but not in the sense in which you're asking it, really, I think. I mean, I've had, as I mentioned, for pronunciation purposes, I've had contact. One of the romance writers whose work I've done, who got the Audie for, actually, I've been in contact with her a fair bit, but it's actually kind of not really very specific to the books. It's more general. So not really, no, which is a little bit of a regret. But equally, I can see how those sorts of contacts could go pear-shaped if you're not careful.
That's true.
And publishers generally want actors to stay away from authors.
So, Just do your own jobs.
Exactly.
What's your favorite book that you've narrated?
Well, I think you've mentioned it, actually. It's very hard to do. I have to check with Audible, by the way, because on my list, I've done over 460 now. But of course, that may include other stuff, but Audible hasn't picked up. But you mentioned Sapiens. I have to say it's right up there with the ones I've enjoyed most. And I think from a number of points of view, number one, I think it's extremely well written. Number two, it's incredibly thought-provoking and challenging. It's one of the books that has left more of a mark on me than most. And I've found for long time afterwards, I've gone back to it and thought, oh yeah, God, what that idea he came up with. So it's and that's not just me. I mean, obviously, there's many people who feel the same. So that's right up there. I mean, I mentioned the Crystal Cave trilogy in fiction. That I thought was absolutely top notch. But there's so many, Toby. I mean, it's so hard to kind of pick ones out. I mean, and they're great for different reasons. There was a long book called The Sleepwalkers about how the world got into the First World War, and it sounds dry, but it was incredible expose of the avoidability of it, and that sort of horrible sense of inevitability for all the wrong reasons that countries are going to end up fighting each other. So stuff like that, stays with you too.
And do you a big do you ingest audiobooks as well? Who are some of your favorite narrators?
I do, but not to the extent I'd like, to be quite honest, because I spend so much time doing it, and I don't tend to find that much time to listen. So I tend to be very kind of scrappy in terms of who I listen to. It's very sort of seat of the pants. Oh, well, that sounds good. I mean, for example, one of the most recent ones I listened to was a guy called James Haskell, who's a rugby player. And he lifted the lid on what a professional rugby player's life is like, which was fabulous. And he was an authentic voice. I listened to Jerry Seinfeld recently, which was mainly lots of his bits of comedy, but that was good. One of the books that I did was struck by most was The Tattooist of Auschwitz. That was an incredible book and incredibly well read. So yeah, when I do get to them, I do still enjoy them, but not as much as I'd like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, we'll just do a couple of these quick answers for these questions that people have written in with. Chen wants to know about gain levels. Do you have to regularly readjust riding your gain, or do you set it fairly low so that you've got sort of headroom?
Yeah, I set it for fairly low, so there's plenty of headroom. No, I don't adjust it. As we said earlier on, I don't touch the controls as such at all.
And a follow-up question to that is, what's your mic technique recommendations for doing audiobooks so you've got the stamina to get through the workload, which is a really good one, because it is, you do need stamina for it, right?
You do. I mean, I think I don't know whether that's mic technique so much as that whole business of pacing yourself and being invested and so on, but. Yeah, I mean, the mic technique that to me is more important is not getting too close at the wrong time. Again,
Proximity.
Lots of fiction books require characters to shout and scream and so on. So I've learned over the years to avoid that. Otherwise, that's when your gain does shoot through the roof.
Exactly. Yeah. Fair enough. There's a question here from Martin Howes, which I might be able to answer more than you, but he's very keen to try and break into the audiobook market. The most prominent site is ACX, which you've mentioned before, which is kind of like a marketplace for audiobook narrators and authors to come together. But they don't accept voices from New Zealand, which is a bit of a middle finger to us over here. Do you have any suggestions for other platforms that do accept? I've heard that Findaway Voices does, Martin. From one of our other listeners. But are there any other platforms that you suggest for newbies to sort of start dipping their toes in the water?
Findaway is one of the ones I would have said. I'm trying to think of others. I'm blanking on it at the minute. There are others. I'll shoot you some names after we finish, and maybe you can,
I can put them up.
Pass those on.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. A couple more questions. We've talked about the editing. You're required to edit the files, obviously, when you send them through. It's finished audio, isn't it? You're recruited to send through perfectly finished audio.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are some of the word counts that you do on an average book? And they've asked about what you'd expect as payment for that as well, but that might be a sensitive topic. And there's probably a massive range from amateur right up to your level.
I'm not going to be very good on this one because I always go by page numbers. That I know people use word counts, but for me the key metric really is the page. So I can't be of much help on that. I mean, I can say that I narrate books that vary in length from 200 pages up to 800 pages. 1100 I think was the biggest one I did. I never use that metric because I was work out my time on the basis of pages, because that once I've done a few pages, I know how long it's going to take me, and then I can kind of plan from there. So sorry, I can't be much help on that.
That's all right. There's no worries at all. So that's pretty much it for today. I just want to thank you so much for me. You really informed my delivery style after listening to Sapiens and Homo Deus. It really affected the way that I read things in that sort of non-fiction vein. So it was a real help to me personally. So thank you for that, and thank you for appearing on this podcast and for Gravy for the Brain here. Just one final question, looking for the future as we go. Do you think the AI and text-to-speech software, is that on your radar in terms of, the people are saying that it'll replace audiobook narrators, but I can't see that myself. But what's your thoughts?
I think I'm old enough not to have to worry about it. That's one of the benefits of age. I do think it's on the radar. I do think it's a potential threat to the live voice. I have heard some of that, and I have to say it's incredibly good, but still not quite as good as the human voice. So it remains to be seen, but I would not write it off. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you're going to find it. Maybe it might impact your work, Toby, more than long form audiobooks, because you can get synthetic voices for, elevator announcements and shops and airports and maybe commercials as well. But it's very good.
It's an interesting time, isn't it? It's all going to change again. Derek Perkins, thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Toby. I've enjoyed it immensely.